The late afternoon light poured through the towering glass windows of Forrester Creations, spreading a soft golden glow across the polished floors of the executive hallway. Outside, the city moved in its usual rhythm, traffic flowing like a restless river through the streets of Los Angeles. Unaware of the quiet emotional storm gathering inside one of the most powerful fashion houses in the industry. Inside the building, the atmosphere felt deceptively calm, the kind of professional stillness that usually surrounded a company accustomed to operating at the highest levels of prestige and influence. Yet beneath that calm exterior, something far more fragile was unfolding. Something rooted not in business rivalry or corporate ambition, but in fear. Taylor Hayes had never been a woman easily shaken by anxiety. Throughout her career as a psychiatrist and throughout the complicated years of her personal life, she had learned how to confront emotional chaos with a sense of rational control. She had spent decades helping others navigate their deepest fears, guiding patients through trauma, grief, and the unpredictable nature of human pain. But the fear that now gripped her heart felt different from anything she had experienced before. It was not the abstract fear of a psychological condition she could analyze or treat. It was the visceral terror of knowing that someone dangerous was out there. Someone whose obsession had shaped entire chapters of her life. That someone was Sheila Carter. Even after all the years that had passed, Sheila's name still carried the weight of every nightmare Taylor had tried to leave behind. The woman had moved through their lives like a shadow that refused to disappear, leaving destruction and trauma wherever she went. Taylor had seen firsthand how deeply Sheila's obsession could run, how it twisted logic and emotion into something terrifyingly unpredictable. And lately, the feeling that Sheila was once again lurking somewhere nearby had become impossible to ignore. Taylor entered the Forrester Creations office with a sense of urgency that immediately caught Steffy's attention. Her daughter had been reviewing sketches and production reports when she looked up and saw the expression on her mother's face. The sight alone was enough to trigger concern. Taylor rarely looked frightened, but now her eyes carried the unmistakable signs of someone who had been living with constant dread. Steffy stood quickly, crossing the office toward her mother with protective instinct already rising in her chest. The bond between them had always been powerful, forged through years of surviving emotional battles together. Steffy knew better than anyone how much Sheila Carter had damaged their lives. She had witnessed the violence, the manipulation, and the relentless obsession that defined Sheila's presence. Seeing that fear return to Taylor's face felt like watching an old wound reopen. Taylor's voice trembled as she began explaining the thoughts that had been haunting her. The words spilled out faster than she expected, as though weeks of suppressed anxiety had finally found an outlet. She described the feeling of being watched, the unsettling sense that Sheila's presence was not truly gone from their world. Even when Sheila disappeared for long periods of time, Taylor had never fully believed that the threat was over. Sheila Carter did not simply vanish. She waited. Taylor spoke about the memories that had begun resurfacing, moments from the past that suddenly felt closer than they had in years. Every shadow, every unexpected noise, every unfamiliar face in a crowd seemed to trigger the same fear. The thought that Sheila might once again target the people she loved had become a constant weight, pressing on her mind. But one name in particular kept appearing in Taylor's thoughts. Deacon. Their complicated relationship had placed him dangerously close to Sheila in ways that made Taylor deeply uneasy. Deacon had always carried a rebellious unpredictability in his personality, and that unpredictability had once drawn him into Sheila's orbit. Taylor could not shake the feeling that he might still be vulnerable. The fear in her voice intensified as she confessed that she no longer felt safe. Not for herself and not for Deacon either. The possibility that Sheila might return, driven by the same twisted obsessions that had once nearly destroyed their lives, was something Taylor could no longer dismiss. Steffy listened with growing determination. Unlike her mother, she refused to allow fear to dictate their future. The moment Taylor finished speaking, Steffy stepped forward with the fierce confidence that had always defined her character. Her voice carried a sharp edge of resolve as she promised that this time things would be different. She would not allow Sheila Carter to continue haunting their lives forever. Steffy had spent too many years watching the people she loved suffer under the chaos Sheila created. The emotional scars left behind by those confrontations had shaped her entire view of the world. And she had reached a point where patience was no longer an option. If Sheila Carter believed she could return again and again without consequences, she was about to learn otherwise. Steffy vowed that she would find a way to remove Sheila from their lives permanently. The promise hung in the air between them like a declaration of war. But neither of them realized that someone else had already heard every word. Standing just outside the partially open office door, Bill Spencer paused in the hallway with an expression of quiet interest. He had originally come to Forrester Creations for reasons related to business negotiations. But the sound of familiar voices had caught his attention before he could enter. Bill was not a man who ignored opportunities. And what he had just overheard sounded very much like one. He remained silent for several moments, absorbing the emotional intensity of the conversation unfolding inside the office. The fear in Taylor's voice and the fierce determination in Steffy's response created a situation that immediately triggered Bill's strategic instincts. Because when desperation entered the equation, people often became willing to make decisions they would otherwise reject. Bill finally stepped into the office with the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly how to control the energy of a room. Steffy turned instantly, surprised by his sudden presence. Taylor's reaction was more cautious. Bill Spencer had always been a complicated figure in their lives. Sometimes an ally, sometimes something far less trustworthy. His reputation for manipulation and ruthless business tactics made it difficult to predict his true intentions. Bill's gaze moved between them slowly, the faintest hint of amusement appearing in his expression. He explained that he had overheard enough of their conversation to understand the situation. The mention of Sheila Carter alone was enough to make the situation intriguing. Bill knew Sheila's history well enough to recognize the danger she represented. But he also understood something else. Fear could be a powerful negotiating tool. Bill spoke carefully, his tone suggesting calm confidence rather than concern. He offered assistance in dealing with Sheila Carter, hinting that he might possess resources capable of solving the problem permanently. Yet there was an unmistakable condition attached to his offer. Nothing Bill Spencer did in life was free. The room fell silent as Steffy tried to process what he was suggesting. She had spent years protecting her family from Sheila's chaos, but the idea of involving Bill in such a matter raised complicated questions. Still, the fear she had just seen in her mother's eyes remained vivid in her mind. And that fear pushed her toward a decision she might never have considered under normal circumstances. Steffy finally spoke with a boldness that surprised even herself. If Bill truly intended to eliminate Sheila Carter from their lives forever, then she was willing to offer something in return. Something extremely valuable. Something extremely dangerous. She offered him access to confidential business information from Forrester Creations. The words seemed to echo in the room after she said them. Taylor's eyes widened in shock. The magnitude of what Steffy had just proposed was enormous. Forrester Creations was not simply a company, it was the legacy of their entire family. The idea of handing sensitive business intelligence to Bill Spencer, a man whose corporate ambitions had often clashed with Forrester interests, bordered on betrayal. Yet Steffy's voice carried unwavering certainty. She believed that protecting her mother's safety mattered more than protecting corporate secrets. Bill watched her carefully as the weight of the proposal settled into the room. Then a slow smile spread across his face. The calculation behind his eyes became unmistakable. He stepped closer, extending his hand toward Steffy in silent agreement. When their hands clasped together, the gesture felt less like a handshake and more like the sealing of a dangerous pact. A pact built on desperation. A pact built on betrayal. Bill accepted the deal without hesitation. The look in his eyes suggested that he had just gained far more than he expected from a simple visit to Forrester Creations. After a few final words, Bill turned and walked toward the door, leaving the office with the quiet confidence of a man who had just secured a powerful advantage. Steffy remained standing near the desk long after he disappeared down the hallway. The silence that followed felt suffocating. Taylor approached slowly, her voice filled with concern as she asked whether Steffy truly understood what she had just done. Steffy did understand. That was exactly why the guilt settling into her chest felt so heavy. Yet she also believed that protecting her mother was worth any sacrifice. Even if that sacrifice meant risking the future of the company her family had built. Later that evening, Steffy sat alone in the office, reviewing files that contained some of the most sensitive information in Forrester Creations. Corporate archives. Every document she opened felt like another step deeper into a decision she could never undo. Her mind battled constantly between two loyalties. One was the loyalty she owed to her family's legacy. The other was the love she felt for her mother. When Liam Spencer unexpectedly appeared at the office door, Steffy quickly closed the documents and forced a calm expression onto her face. Liam immediately sensed that something was wrong, but Steffy deflected his questions with practiced composure. She refused to reveal the truth. Meanwhile, across the city, Bill Spencer sat alone in his office reviewing the confidential information Steffy had already begun delivering to him. The satisfaction on his face was unmistakable. The deal he had just secured gave him a strategic advantage over Forrester Creations that few people in the industry could have imagined. And all it had cost him was a promise. Back at Forrester Creations, Steffi stood alone near the large window overlooking the city skyline. Her eyes slowly moved toward the iconic Forrester logo displayed proudly inside the office. For the first time in her life, she wondered if protecting her family might require sacrificing something equally important. The realization struck her with painful clarity. In trying to save her mother from one danger, she might have just invited another into their lives. And that new danger had already begun to take shape. The quiet glow of the city skyline reflected across the glass walls of Steffi's office as night slowly settled over Los Angeles. Inside Forrester Creations, most of the building had already emptied. Designers had left their workstations. Assistants had turned off their computers. And the usual rhythm of a fashion empire had faded into the subdued silence of late evening. But Steffi remained alone, standing near the window where the illuminated Forrester logo glowed proudly against the dark interior wall. The symbol had always represented strength, legacy, and family loyalty. Tonight, however, the sight of it filled her with a heavy mixture of pride and guilt that refused to settle into anything resembling peace. Her hands still rested on the edge of the desk where the confidential files had been spread out. Earlier, the documents were no longer visible. She had carefully secured them before leaving the office earlier in the day. Yet the knowledge of what she had done lingered in the room like a shadow that refused to disappear. She had crossed a line she had never imagined crossing, trading corporate secrets for a promise that Bill Spencer would eliminate the threat of Sheila Carter once and for all. In the moment when she made that decision, it had felt like the only choice she had left. Her mother's fear had been so real, so consuming, that Steffi could not bear the thought of watching Taylor live under that constant terror again. But now, standing alone with her thoughts, the consequences of that choice were beginning to take shape in ways she could no longer ignore. The next morning arrived with a tension in the Forrester building that seemed almost electric. The employees who filtered through the hallways sensed that something unusual was happening even if they did not yet understand exactly what it was. Rumors traveled quickly in a place like this, and whispers had already begun circulating through the design teams and executive offices. Someone had discovered irregular activity involving sensitive company files. Security protocols had been triggered overnight, and the senior executives were already meeting behind closed doors to understand what had happened. Inside the executive conference room, Ridge Forrester stood at the head of the table with a look of controlled fury that few people had ever seen from him before. The large screen mounted on the wall displayed a series of digital records showing exactly when certain confidential documents had been accessed and transferred. The timestamps were precise, leaving very little room for interpretation, and the name attached to the access logs was impossible to ignore. Steffi Forrester. Ridge stared at the screen as if the letters themselves were a betrayal he could not fully comprehend. His daughter had always been one of the fiercest defenders of the company. She had fought tirelessly to protect Forrester Creations from competitors, critics, and anyone who tried to undermine the family legacy. The idea that she could be responsible for leaking confidential business information felt almost unreal, yet the evidence was undeniable. The files that had been accessed were not ordinary documents. They contained strategic data, upcoming collection concepts, supplier negotiations, and internal projections that could provide enormous leverage to anyone who obtained them. In the wrong hands, that information could shift the balance of power within the fashion industry overnight. And the company most capable of using that information was one Ridge knew all too well: Spencer Publications. Ridge clenched his jaw as the realization settled into his mind. Bill Spencer. The connection felt like a punch to the chest. For years Ridge had battled Bill's ruthless business strategies, protecting Forrester Creations from corporate maneuvers that often bordered on predatory. Bill respected power and opportunity, but he rarely cared about loyalty or emotional consequences when business advantage was involved. The thought that Bill might now hold confidential Forrester information was enough to make Ridge's blood run cold, and the person responsible was his own daughter. When Steffi entered the building later that morning, she immediately sensed that something had changed. Conversations in the hallway stopped the moment she walked past. Several employees glanced at her with expressions that carried a strange mixture of curiosity and concern. The tension was impossible to miss. She had barely reached her office when an assistant approached with a quiet message. Ridge wanted to see her immediately. Steffi felt a knot tighten in her stomach as she walked toward the executive conference room. Somewhere deep inside she already understood what was about to happen. Secrets rarely remained hidden for long in a company as tightly connected as Forrester Creations. And if Ridge had discovered the truth about the files, the confrontation she had been quietly dreading was now unavoidable. When she pushed open the door, the room felt colder than usual. Ridge stood near the center of the table, his posture rigid, his expression dark with restrained anger. Several other senior executives sat silently along the edges of the room, their presence making the moment feel less like a private family conversation and more like a corporate tribunal. Steffy closed the door slowly behind her. For several seconds neither of them spoke. Then Ridge turned toward her with a look that cut deeper than any shouted accusation. His voice, when it finally came, was quiet but sharp enough to slice through the silence. He asked her if she had anything to explain. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Steffy's heart pounded as she realized there was no way to avoid the truth. She had always believed that honesty, no matter how painful, was better than hiding behind half-truths. Even now, knowing what the consequences might be, she refused to deny what she had done. She admitted it. The words left her mouth with a strange calmness that surprised even her. She confirmed that she had accessed the files and shared information with Bill Spencer. A ripple of shock passed through the room. Ridge's face hardened instantly, the disappointment in his eyes more painful than anger alone could ever be. For a moment he looked not like the powerful leader of Forrester Creations but like a father, struggling to recognize the daughter standing in front of him. His voice rose slightly as he demanded to know why. Why would she betray the company her family had built? Why would she hand their competitive advantage directly to a man who had spent years trying to undermine them? Steffy felt the weight of every gaze in the room as she struggled to find the words that could explain the impossible position she had been forced into. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke about Taylor's fear, about the constant shadow of Sheila Carter that had returned to haunt their lives. She described the conversation in her office, the desperation she saw in her mother's eyes, the moment when she realized that protecting Taylor might require sacrifices she had never imagined making. Bill Spencer had offered a solution. Not a legal one, not a moral one, but a permanent one. The words came out faster now as Steffy explained that she believed Bill had the resources to remove Sheila Carter from their lives forever. The idea of living without that constant threat had seemed worth almost any price. Even the price of betraying corporate loyalty. Ridge listened without interrupting, but the pain in his expression grew deeper with every sentence. When Steffy finally finished speaking, the silence in the room felt suffocating. Ridge walked slowly around the table, stopping just a few feet in front of her. His eyes held a mixture of sorrow and anger that was almost impossible to look at. He told her that protecting family was important, but not at the cost of destroying the very legacy that family had built. Forrester Creations was not just a company. It was the work of generations. It was the identity of their entire family. And by handing confidential information to Bill Spencer, Steffy had placed that legacy directly into the hands of one of their most dangerous rivals. The decision, no matter how well-intentioned, could not be undone. Ridge's voice broke slightly as he delivered the words that followed. He told her she was no longer CEO of Forrester Creations. The room seemed to spin around Steffy as the reality of the statement settled into her mind. Her position, her authority, her role in guiding the company's future, all of it had just been taken away. Steffy tried to speak, her voice trembling as she insisted that she never intended to harm the company. Everything she had done was driven by the desperate need to protect her mother. But Ridge shook his head slowly. Intentions did not erase consequences. The damage had already been done. He told her that until the company could fully assess the impact of the leaked information, she would be removed from all executive responsibilities. The decision was final. Steffy stood frozen as the meeting ended and the other executives quietly left the room. Within minutes she was alone with her father in the large conference space that had once represented her greatest professional achievements. The silence between them felt unbearable. Ridge turned away from her, staring out the tall windows overlooking the city. The anger that had fueled his decision was now slowly giving way to something more complicated. Grief. He had always believed Steffy would be the future of Forrester Creations. Now that future felt uncertain. When Steffy finally walked out of the conference room, the hallway outside seemed longer than she remembered. Every step carried the weight of what she had just lost. Across town, in a sleek office filled with the polished steel and glass of Spencer Publications, Bill Spencer leaned back in his chair as he studied the confidential documents spread across his desk. The faint smile on his face revealed a man who understood exactly how powerful his new position had become. With the information Steffy had given him, he now held a strategic advantage over Forrester Creations that could reshape the fashion industry. And the most remarkable part of it all was that the advantage had been handed to him willingly. Bill lifted one of the documents, studying it with quiet satisfaction. Meanwhile, at Forrester Creations, Steffy stood alone in her empty office. staring at the glowing company logo on the wall. Only hours earlier she had believed she was saving her mother. Now she realized that in doing so, she might have opened the door to a new disaster. Because the man she trusted to solve one threat might soon become an even greater one.